While grown men were breaking their own dining tables into kindling and watching their children freeze to death inside hand-hewn log cabins, one man sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves at 64 degrees, and his fire had been dead for over 7 hours. Outside, across the frozen expanse of Montana's Blackfoot Valley, the winter of 1887 was putting on a display of pure, unadulterated savagery. The wind howled off the Continental Divide at 40 miles an hour, driving the ambient air temperature down to a terrifying 32 degrees below zero. If you stepped outside without heavy wool and wolfskin, your exposed skin would freeze solid in less than 3 minutes. Yet on the windward eastern slope of a barren ridge, there stood a scene so strange that travelers on the trail below dismissed it as an optical illusion. You could look directly at the hillside and see almost nothing at all. There was no grand timber frame, no stone chimney towering against the gray sky, and no stack of seasoned pine piled high against a porch wall. All that existed was a low, subtle mound buried beneath 2 feet of drifted snow, looking for all the world like an abandoned root cellar or a forgotten badger burrow. The only sign of human presence was a faint, almost invisible wisp of clear vapor rising from a small, hollowed cedar log poking out of the white crust. To the experienced frontiersmen of the valley, a setup like that meant suicide. Everyone knew that an underground hole was nothing more than a damp, freezing grave that would pull the heat right out of your bones. Inside that buried mound, however, a completely different reality was unfolding. Elias Vance sat at a rough-sawn pine table, casually turning the page of a book by the yellow light of an oil lamp. He wasn't wearing an overcoat. He wasn't wrapped in heavy buffalo robes. He was wearing a light cotton flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, breathing clean, dry air that held a rock-steady temperature of 64 degrees Fahrenheit. A few feet away, on a floor paved with smooth river granite, his 2 young daughters were playing with carved wooden blocks. They weren't shivering, they weren't wearing gloves, and they weren't huddling against a roaring fire. In fact, if you looked into the small sandstone hearth positioned near the front entry, you would see nothing but cold ash and a few glowing embers from a fire that had burned out right after breakfast. Out in the valley, men were burning through a full cord of seasoned firewood every 4 days just to keep their living rooms at 38 degrees. Elias Vance was burning just 4 to 6 small logs per day. His design achieved a 96-degree temperature differential between the inside of his home and the howling Arctic wilderness outside. For 32 consecutive days during the worst polar vortex in recorded American history, his shelter stayed warm, dry, and completely draft-free without requiring a continuous fire. Before we dive into how a humble former stonemason figured out a physical secret that the most experienced builders in the territory had completely missed, do us a quick favor. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to our channel, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. We read every single comment, and your support helps us bring you more real historical survival stories every single week. Now, let's go back to where this incredible story began. Elias Vance was not an eccentric dreamer or a man looking to make a point to his neighbors. He was a 36-year-old former stonemason and carpenter from Pennsylvania, built with the broad shoulders and quiet demeanor of someone who spent his entire life working alongside physical materials. In the spring of 1885, Elias arrived in the Blackfoot Valley alongside his wife Clara and their 2 young daughters, 8-year-old Hannah and 5-year-old Martha. Like hundreds of other families heading west, they brought everything they owned in a single covered wagon, determined to carve out a permanent homestead from the wild Montana territory. That first summer, Elias built what everyone in the valley considered a proper, respectable home. He felled straight lodgepole pines, notched the corners with meticulous precision, and chinked the gaps with local clay, dried moss, and straw. He built a fine stone fireplace on the north wall, laid down a raised plank floor to keep ground moisture out, and built a steep shake roof to shed the heavy mountain snow. When the golden light of late September hit that cabin, it looked like a postcard of American frontier triumph. Then came the winter of 1885. It wasn't even a record-breaking winter by Montana standards, but it delivered a brutal lesson in basic physics that nearly destroyed the Vance family. Elias quickly discovered that a traditional timber cabin is essentially a sieve for heat. Wood, while a decent natural insulator in mild weather, expands and contracts constantly with temperature swings. As the bitter mountain winds battered the cabin, the chinking cracked, creating microscopic gaps that allowed icy air to infiltrate every corner of the room. Worse still was the phenomenon of convective cooling. The cold wind blowing across the outer surface of the round logs stripped thermal energy away from the timber far faster than the open fireplace could ever replace it. Elias would build a roaring fire in the hearth, creating a localized zone of scorching heat within 4 feet of the stone. But near the floorboards, cold air drawn inward by the chimney's draft created an icy current that swept across the room. The interior walls sprouted a thick layer of white frost. Water pails left near the table froze solid overnight, splitting the oak staves. Clara had to keep little Martha wrapped in 3 layers of wool blankets, even while sitting inside the living room. But the real nightmare began when 8-year-old Hannah developed a deep, rattling lung cough. Every night, as the fire naturally died down in the small hours before dawn and the cabin's temperature plummeted into the 20s, Hannah would wake up choking on cold, smoky air. Elias spent that entire winter in a state of perpetual exhaustion. He slept in 2-hour shifts, waking up in the dark to feed the ravenous firebox. He burned through 6 full cords of dry wood before February even arrived. By March, with his seasoned woodpile completely exhausted, he was out in thigh-deep snow, desperately felling green pine trees and hauling them back on a hand sled. The green wood hissed, sputtered, and filled the cabin with stinging creosote smoke, providing half the heat for double the labor. As he watched his daughter cough in her damp, freezing bed, Elias realized that continuing to live like this wasn't just miserable, it was a recipe for tragedy. When spring finally thawed the Blackfoot Valley in April of 1886, Hannah's cough slowly vanished, but Elias's mind remained locked on the problem. He spent hours analyzing the physical behavior of heat during those grueling winter months. He remembered sitting by the hearth in the darkest hours of January, noticing that while the air in the cabin cooled off the instant the flames died, the heavy sandstone rocks that formed the fireplace remained warm to the touch for nearly 12 hours. That was his first major realization. Air cannot hold heat, but dense physical mass can. A room full of warm air is easily emptied the moment a door opens or a draft enters through a wall seam. But a stone mass that has absorbed thermal energy acts like a heat battery. It charges up slowly when exposed to high temperatures, and then it releases that stored energy continuously into its environment over a prolonged period. His second realization came while he was clearing a drainage ditch near the base of the ridge behind his cabin in early May. Digging through 4 feet of topsoil to lay a gravel drain, he reached down to clear a handful of clay and stopped in his tracks. The soil 4 feet beneath the surface was cool, but it wasn't cold. In fact, while the air temperature at the surface swung wildly from 30 degrees at night to 70 degrees during the day, the earth deep beneath his boots felt remarkably stable. Elias began conducting a series of simple, methodical tests. He borrowed a mercury glass thermometer and buried it at different depths around his homestead. What he discovered changed his entire perspective on frontier architecture. At a depth of 6 to 8 feet below the surface, the soil maintained a rock-steady baseline temperature between 50 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit all year round. In the dead of winter, when the air above was 30 below zero, the earth beneath the frost line remained at 52 degrees. In the blistering heat of July, it stayed at 52 degrees. The conclusion was undeniable. The atmosphere was an enemy that had to be constantly fought with massive amounts of fire, but the deep earth was a permanent thermal sanctuary. If you built a home above ground, you were trying to heat an environment that was starting at a baseline of minus 20 degrees. But if you built a home 6 feet below the surface, the earth itself provided a free, natural baseline of 52 degrees. You only needed to generate enough heat to raise the room another 12 to 14 degrees to achieve perfect human comfort. Elias sat down at his kitchen table and began sketching a new kind of home, a structure that worked alongside the laws of thermodynamics rather than trying to overpower them. His blueprint was for an earth-sheltered dugout carved 14 feet deep into the south-facing slope of the ridge. The design relied on three core principles. First, 3 of the 4 living walls would be formed by the undisturbed, living earth of the hillside, surrounding the room with over 50,000 pounds of natural thermal mass that would keep the home locked at its 52-degree baseline. Second, the single exposed wall would face directly south, featuring a hand-built timber facade with a double-paned glass window angled at precisely 26 degrees. This specific angle matched the low trajectory of the winter sun in Montana, allowing passive solar radiation to penetrate deep into the room during the cold months while blocking the high summer sun. Third, the subfloor would be excavated an extra 20 inches, filled with a deep drainage bed of coarse river gravel and paved with 6,500 pounds of dense river granite stones to serve as an interior heat battery. In July of 1887, while his neighbors were busy cutting hay and enjoying the warm summer breeze, Elias Vance walked up the ridge behind his log cabin with a pickaxe, a flat shovel, and a heavy wooden wheelbarrow. He marked out a rectangle 18 feet wide by 22 feet long on the south-facing slope and began breaking ground. It was grueling, back-breaking physical labor. The soil on the ridge was a stubborn mix of dense clay, glacial till, and embedded river rock. Day after day, under the blazing summer sun, Elias swung the pick, loosened the earth, loaded the wheelbarrow, and wheeled hundreds of loads of soil down the slope to build a level terrace in front of his site. By the end of the second week, his hands were calloused over, his back burned with fatigue, and he had carved a 4-foot drop into the face of the hill. Naturally, a project this unusual didn't stay a secret for long in a small homesteading community. Neighbors riding past on the valley trail would stop their horses, stare up at the ridge, and watch Elias digging himself deeper and deeper into the dirt. The true test of his resolve came in mid-August, when Elias rode his wagon down to the Blackfoot trading post to purchase iron door hinges, window glass, and several barrels of raw linseed oil. The trading post was the social hub of the valley, a dusty building smelling of tobacco, leather, and cured hams, where local ranchers gathered to exchange news and gossip. As Elias walked inside, Gideon Thorne, a prominent timber merchant who owned the local sawmill and built most of the grand wood frame houses in the area, leaned against the counter with a cup of coffee. Beside him stood Ephraim Holt, a senior homesteader who had lived in the territory for 20 years and considered himself the supreme authority on frontier survival. Gideon looked at Elias, a broad smirk spreading across his face. He asked Elias if he was digging a root cellar or if he was just practicing digging his own grave early to save his wife the trouble. The men sitting around the potbelly stove burst into loud laughter. Gideon went on, telling everyone within earshot that a grown man bringing his family to the territory ought to build them a proper, civilized house out of milled lumber instead of hiding them away in a badger burrow like a frightened animal. Ephraim Holt nodded in agreement, pointing a weathered finger at Elias. He told Elias that he had seen plenty of greenhorns come out west with fancy ideas, but trying to live underground was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard of. He warned Elias that an earth hole would trap dampness, turn into a moldy swamp by November, and cave in on his family the second the ground froze and expanded. Elias listened quietly, never raising his voice or losing his temper. He simply paid for his hardware, loaded his wagon, and thanked the men for their opinions before driving back to his ridge. But while Elias had the mental fortitude to shrug off the community's mockery, the social cost fell heavily on his wife. When Clara attended church socials or sewing circles in town, the other women treated her with a mixture of soft pity and condescending judgment. They whispered behind her back, asking if her husband had lost his mind or if the family was so broke that they couldn't afford timber. Clara returned home some evenings with tears in her eyes, asking Elias if they were making a terrible mistake. Elias would sit her down, take her hands in his, and remind her of the freezing nights of the previous winter, promising her that when the cold arrived, their home would be a place of absolute safety. By late August, Elias had excavated 14 feet straight back into the hillside, creating a massive, 3-sided earthen amphitheater. But just as the project was moving into its framing phase, nature delivered an obstacle that nearly destroyed the entire build. While pickaxing through the deepest section of the rear wall, Elias struck a massive, solid granite ledge that extended across the entire back boundary of the excavation. It was an enormous piece of bedrock, far too large to break apart with hand tools and impossible to remove without high explosives that Elias couldn't afford. To make matters worse, that very evening, a sudden late summer cloudburst stalled over the Blackfoot Valley. Torrential rain poured down for 5 straight hours, turning the dry clay hillsides into rivers of mud. As Elias stood under a canvas tarp at the edge of the pit, he watched in horror as water began pooling at the bottom of the excavation, threatening to undermine the raw earth sidewalls and trigger a catastrophic landslide that would fill his weeks of work in minutes. Many men would have seen this double disaster as a sign to give up, fill in the hole, and build a standard log cabin. But Elias possessed the unique problem-solving mind of a master builder. Instead of panicking, he immediately went to work, making the natural environment work for him. First, he tackled the water problem. To solve the dampness issue that made historical dugouts notorious mold traps, Elias engineered a permanent moisture mitigation network. He dug a deep perimeter trench around the inside base of the earth walls, filling it with a 10-inch bed of coarse, washed river gravel. He angled this trench at a precise 2% downhill grade, leading toward the front facade, creating a classic French drain system. Any water that seeped through the hillside earth would hit this gravel channel, drop by gravity beneath the living floor, and drain harmlessly out the front terrace away from the home. Next, he looked at the massive granite ledge he had exposed in the rear wall and realized it wasn't an obstacle, it was a blessing. Rather than trying to chip the granite away, he spent 4 days painstakingly squaring off its top surface using a heavy chisel. He transformed the solid bedrock ledge into an integrated 6-foot-deep sleeping platform that was literally part of the mountain itself. Because the granite was connected directly to the deep thermal mass of the earth, it would maintain the same stable temperature baseline as the hillside, creating a bed frame that could never rot, creak, or freeze. Finally, to address the issue of air quality and humidity control, Elias designed a passive stack effect ventilation system. He knew that warm, moist air created by human breathing and cooking naturally rises. He hollowed out a 8-foot-long cedar log, treated the outside with waterproof pine tar, and installed it vertically through the rear sod roof as a high exhaust flue. He then installed a second, lower intake pipe near the front door at floor level. This created a continuous, self-regulating air loop. Cool, fresh air was drawn inward near the front entry, passed over the dry stone floor, warmed up as it absorbed heat from the room, and then exited through the high roof flue, carrying away moisture, odors, and carbon dioxide, without requiring any electrical fans or creating cold drafts across the living space. With the structural crisis resolved and the drainage network in place, Elias entered the final, crucial phase of construction in September 1887. The framing of the roof had to be engineered to support an unimaginable amount of weight. Not just the weight of the timber itself, but the massive load of wet soil, sod, and winter snow that would rest on top of it. Elias selected 6 massive, 10-inch thick Douglas fir logs for the primary ceiling beams. Instead of resting them on wooden posts that could rot or shift, he carved deep pockets directly into the solid granite bedrock of the rear ledge and the rock-reinforced sidewalls. Each beam was notched into stone, transferring the ceiling load directly to the earth's foundation. Over these primary beams, he laid a tight deck of hand-split cedar planks, fitting them together so closely that hardly a sliver of light could pass between them. Now came the waterproofing and insulation layers. Over the cedar planking, Elias laid a heavy canvas tarp that he had saturated in a boiled mixture of pine tar, linseed oil, and pulverized charcoal. This created a flexible, completely impermeable membrane that water could never penetrate. Over this tarred canvas, he added a 6-inch layer of dry river sand to act as a leveling cushion. Finally, he topped the entire roof with 14 inches of living prairie sod, cut directly from the meadow floor in neat, interlocking blocks, with the native grass roots still intact. Within weeks, the grass roots knitted together, creating a seamless, living blanket that bound the roof soil into a single, indestructible unit. When Elias calculated the thermal resistance of this ceiling assembly, the math was staggering. 14 inches of compacted sod, combined with the tarred canvas, the sand cushion, and the solid fir beams, provided an effective insulation value exceeding R120. A standard log cabin roof with wooden shakes offered an R value of maybe R3 or R4. Elias had built a ceiling that was 30 times more resistant to heat loss than any house in the valley. To complete the front facade, Elias built a 4-foot-thick stone wall, using local sandstone blocks held together with a lime and clay mortar. In the center of this wall, he installed a thick, hand-planked oak door, lined with wool felt weather stripping. To the right of the door, he set a small, double-paned glass window facing directly south. Inside the shelter, he paved the entire floor with 6,500 pounds of smooth, flat river granite pavers laid over the gravel drainage bed. In the center of the front room, he constructed a compact sandstone firebox, featuring an internal serpentine flue. Instead of letting the hot smoke fly straight up a short chimney, the flue forced the hot exhaust gases to travel through a shaped channel inside the sandstone body before exiting. This design ensured that 80% of the thermal energy produced by burning wood was absorbed by the sandstone mass, rather than lost out the chimney. In early October 1887, as the first light dustings of autumn frost coated the Blackfoot Valley, Elias, Clara, Hannah, and Martha officially moved their beds into the dugout. The neighbors watched from afar, shaking their heads as the Vance family disappeared into the hillside. Gideon Thorne openly predicted that the family wouldn't last until Thanksgiving before dampness and cold drove them out. But inside the buried shelter, as Elias shut the heavy oak door for the first time, a deep, peaceful quiet descended on the room. The air was dry, mild, and utterly still. The winter of 1887 did not arrive with a gentle, gradual transition. It struck the Montana Territory like a atmospheric hammer on the morning of November 14th. Historical weather records would later mark this event as the beginning of the Great Die-Up, a catastrophic polar vortex that altered the history of the American West forever. The storm began with a sudden, terrifying drop in barometric pressure. At midnight on November 13th, the air in the Blackfoot Valley was a relatively mild 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By 4 o'clock the next morning, an enormous Arctic air mass, originating deep in the Canadian Northwest Territories, broke free and surged southward along the eastern face of the Rocky Mountains. By sunrise, the thermometer on the porch of the Blackfoot trading post had dropped to 22 degrees below zero. By noon, it hit -35. By midnight on the second day, the mercury retreated into its bulb at 42 degrees below zero, and the wind began to roar. It was a wind that defied description. Sustained at 40 miles an hour, with gusts reaching 70, the gale carried fine, powdery snow that hit exposed surfaces like pulverized glass. The wind chill factor plummeted to an estimated 70 degrees below zero. The extreme nature of the cold produced soundscapes that terrified even veteran frontiersmen. In the dense pine forests surrounding the valley, the moisture deep inside the trunks of 100-year-old trees froze instantly and expanded. All through the night, massive loud reports echoed across the mountains like artillery fire, as standing pine trees literally exploded from internal ice pressure. Birds flying between roosts froze mid-flight, their tiny bodies dropping out of the sky like stones to bounce off the frozen snow crust. Livestock out on the open range wandered aimlessly into fence corners, blinded by ice, freezing their eyelids shut, until they stood huddling together and froze to death where they stood. Inside the conventional log cabins across the valley, the storm transformed everyday life into a desperate battle for survival. The wind was so relentless that it created massive pressure differentials across the exterior walls of wooden buildings. Cold air was forced through every microfissure in the chinking, sweeping across floorboards like liquid nitrogen. What made this cold event historically unprecedented was not just its intensity, but its duration. Day after day, the sun rose in a pale, ice-fogged sky, offered no warmth, and set again. The polar vortex stalled directly over the region and locked itself into place. 1 day turned into 5, 5 days turned into 10, 10 days turned into 2 weeks. The calendar pages flipped from mid-November into December, and the thermometer outside the trading post never once rose above 15 degrees below zero. The clock was ticking on 32 consecutive days of lethal, unbroken, sub-zero cold, a crucible that would systematically test every building, every material, and every human being in the Blackfoot Valley to the absolute limit. While the polar vortex held the valley in its frozen vice, the weaknesses of conventional frontier architecture were laid bare in horrifying detail. Over at the grand, two-story house owned by Gideon Thorne, the timber merchant who had mocked Elias at the trading post, the situation had devolved into absolute chaos. Gideon's home had been built using the finest milled lumber money could buy, featuring large rooms, tall ceilings, and expansive glass windows. But in 40 below weather, those architectural luxuries became fatal liabilities. The heat from his 2 massive iron stoves rose instantly to the high, uninsulated ceilings, leaving the floor level hovering near freezing. The draft drawn by the stoves was so powerful that cold air rushed inward through every window frame, door jamb, and floorboard seam. By the second week of the freeze, the interior walls of Gideon's parlor were coated in an inch of white frost. Water pails kept sitting right next to his kitchen stove, froze solid overnight. In a panic, Gideon and his hired hands began burning wood at an astronomical rate, fueling the stoves day and night. By day 18, Gideon's carefully prepared 10-cord woodpile was completely gone. In sheer desperation, he and his men took axes to his wooden fences, then his barn outbuildings, and finally his own dining room chairs and oak furniture, breaking them into pieces just to keep a flame alive. Despite burning thousands of pounds of fuel, his family was forced to abandon the upper bedrooms entirely and sleep in a tight ring around the kitchen stove wrapped in wolfskin robes, suffering from severe frostnip on their fingers and toes. 2 miles down the trail, senior homesteader Ephraim Holt was fighting his own losing war against the elements. Ephraim's log cabin was built heavy and strong, but the extreme freeze caused the ground beneath his shallow stone footings to heave violently. The shifting foundation warped the log walls, popping out the moss, chinking in long strips and shearing off iron nails with loud metallic snaps. Through these open gaps, the sub-zero wind poured into the cabin. To stop the drafts, Ephraim's wife tacked wool blankets over the interior walls, but the moisture from their breath condensed on the cold fabric and froze, turning the blankets into sheets of solid ice. Worst of all was the smoke. Because the howling wind created massive turbulence over his stone chimney, the hearth repeatedly backdrafted, filling the sealed cabin with thick, suffocating wood smoke. Ephraim's family spent days crawling on the floor to breathe below the smoke layer, their eyes burning and their lungs inflamed. His youngest grandchild developed a croup cough so severe that her lips turned blue, while Ephraim spent every morning out in the killing wind with a splitting maul, desperately trying to chop frozen, snow-soaked log piles that produced more bitter smoke than heat. Across the entire Blackfoot Valley, the story was identical. Families were running out of fuel, inhaling dangerous carbon monoxide, suffering from chilblains, and watching their food stores freeze into useless rocks. The grand timber structures that had symbolized success and civilization during the warm months of summer had been exposed for what they truly were: beautiful, fragile wooden cages that bled heat and offered almost no real protection when nature showed its true power. 300 yards up the ridge, buried beneath the deep snowdrift that had accumulated on the southern slope, the Vance family was living in a world that felt entirely removed from the nightmare taking place in the valley below. Step inside Elias's earth-sheltered dugout on the 18th day of the Great Freeze. As you open the heavy wool-felted oak door and step across the threshold, the deafening roar of the 40-mile-an-hour wind instantly vanishes, replaced by a deep, heavy, tranquil silence. The air inside does not smell like wood, smoke, mold, or freezing dampness. It smells clean, warm, and slightly sweet, like dry, rich soil and cured cedar. There is no frost on the walls, no ice on the floor, and no draft pulling across your ankles. The heart of this sanctuary is the physics of thermal mass, working in perfect harmony with the geothermal baseline of the Earth. Surrounding the living space on three sides is 14 feet of undisturbed mountain hillside, over 50,000 pounds of earth, that never drops below its natural baseline of 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The earth walls act as an infinite thermal insulator, preventing the 32 below air outside from ever reaching the living envelope. Meanwhile, the 6,500 pounds of river granite pavers that pave the floor, along with the solid granite sleeping bench carved into the back wall, act as a massive thermal flywheel. Every morning at 7 o'clock, Elias opens his small sandstone stove and lights a modest fire using just 2 small split pine logs. Because the stove features an internal serpentine flue, the hot exhaust gases pass through 5 feet of internal sandstone channels before exiting the roof pipe. The sandstone absorbs nearly 80% of the heat generated by the combustion. Within 45 minutes, the small fire burns out completely, leaving behind a handful of clean ash. For the next 18 hours, no fire burns in the dugout. None is needed. The sandstone stove body, the river granite floor, and the solid granite sleeping bench gradually release the heat they absorbed during that 45-minute burn. They radiate gentle, long-wave thermal energy directly into the air and into the bodies of the people sitting in the room. While the temperature outside sits at 32 degrees below zero, the thermometer hanging from the fir beam in the center of the dugout reads a steady, unyielding 64 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, as the family sleeps on the warm granite bench lined with wool pads, the temperature drops by only 3 or 4 degrees, bottoming out at 60 degrees by dawn. The impact on the family's health and well-being was miraculous. 8-year-old Hannah, who had suffered so terribly from a lung cough in the drafty cabin the previous winter, was thriving. In the clean, draft-free, steady 64-degree air maintained by the passive stack ventilation system, her respiratory inflammation healed completely. She and her sister Martha spent their days sitting on the warm stone floor playing games, wearing simple cotton dresses without shoes or heavy shawls. The fuel economy was almost unbelievable. While his neighbors were burning through 3 to 5 full cords of wood over the course of the 32-day freeze, Elias burned a grand total of 1/3 of a cord. His daily fuel consumption consisted of just 4 to 6 small split logs. His main outdoor wood stack, which he had laboriously cut and stacked during the autumn, sat virtually untouched beneath its canvas tarp on the terrace. Elias had successfully removed his family from the vicious cycle of endless winter labor, turning what should have been a struggle for survival into a period of quiet, restful comfort. By December 7th, the Blackfoot Valley had been locked in the grip of the polar freeze for 24 consecutive days. The situation among the homesteaders had reached a critical flashpoint. Word had reached the trading post that 2 families on the South Trail had been forced to burn the wooden walls of their own barns to keep their children warm, while several others had abandoned their claims entirely to huddle in the overcrowded back rooms of the town saloon. Gideon Thorne, whose own grand timber house was rapidly running out of burnable wood, mounted his draft horse to ride across the northern trail. He was searching for any fallen timber along the creek bed that could be dragged back and chopped for fuel. His face was wrapped in thick wool scarves, his beard was a block of frozen ice, and his horse's breath blew out in thick, white plumes that crystallized instantly in the bitter air. As Gideon rode past the base of the eastern ridge, he looked up toward the spot where he remembered seeing Elias Vance digging his badger hole back in August. Gideon fully expected to see a dark, frozen slope. In his mind, there was no doubt that the crazy Pennsylvania carpenter and his family had either fled to town weeks ago or succumbed to the freezing dampness of their dirt pit. Instead, as Gideon reined in his horse and squinted through the sparkling ice fog, he saw something that made him rub his eyes in disbelief. High up on the ridge terrace, where Elias's main outdoor woodpile was stored under a snow-covered canvas tarp, the stack appeared almost completely undisturbed. It was full, neat, and stacked high, looking exactly as it had in October. Then Gideon looked at the mound itself. A faint, almost invisible thread of clear, hot air was wafting up from the small cedar flue sticking out of the snow-covered sod roof. There was no thick, black cloud of wood smoke like the ones pouring desperately from the chimneys in the valley. Just a delicate shimmer of heat distortion against the pale blue sky. Driven by a combination of intense curiosity, disbelief, and sheer physical cold, Gideon turned his horse off the trail and forced the animal up the deep snowdrifts lining the ridge slope. As he reached the level terrace in front of the dugout, he dismounted, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen crust. He walked up to the heavy oak door set into the stone facade, fully expecting to hear the sound of a family shivering or the crackle of a roaring furnace. Instead, there was only silence. He raised a heavy, wool-gloved hand and knocked 3 times on the thick wood. A moment later, the iron latch clicked. The heavy door swung inward, and Gideon Thorne stood frozen in his tracks, his mouth falling open beneath his frost-covered scarf. Standing in the doorway was Elias Vance. He wasn't wearing a fur coat. He wasn't wearing a heavy wool coat. He was wearing a light cotton flannel shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, displaying bare, warm skin. His face was relaxed. His breathing was slow and easy, and a gentle wave of dry, mild, fragrant heat poured out of the doorway, wrapping around Gideon's ice-encrusted body like a warm blanket. Elias looked at the freezing timber merchant, smiled politely, and stepped back from the entrance, inviting Gideon to step inside out of the cold. Gideon Thorne stepped across the threshold, his heavy, ice-coated boots thudding onto the floor, and stopped dead in his tracks. 3 minutes later, a second rider arrived on the terrace, senior homesteader Ephraim Holt, who had seen Gideon turn off the trail and followed him up the ridge to investigate. Ephraim stepped inside, pulled a brass-cased spirit thermometer from his coat, and joined Gideon in what would become the most thorough physical inspection of a structure in the history of the Montana Territory. The 2 skeptics, who had publicly mocked Elias at the trading post 4 months earlier, conducted their examination in 4 distinct, methodical steps. Step 1. The air temperature measurement. Ephraim held his calibrated brass thermometer at chest level in the center of the room. The mercury column rose steadily, crossing 30, 40, 50, and finally settling at a rock-solid 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Gideon immediately walked over to the sandstone firebox set near the front wall to check the heat source. He opened the iron door and looked inside. The hearth was completely cold. There was no flame, no crackling wood, and no glowing coal, nothing but a small bed of fine gray ash that had been dead for over 7 hours. Yet the air in the room was as mild and comfortable as a late May afternoon. Step 2. The surface mass examination. Confused and disoriented by the warmth, Gideon pulled off his heavy leather gloves and began physically testing the room's surfaces with his bare hands. He walked to the rear of the room and pressed his palm against the raw earth back wall that had been cut into the hillside. The soil felt firm, completely dry, and held a steady, cool baseline of 52 degrees, acting as a barrier that blocked the sub-zero cold outside from penetrating the room. Next, he walked over to the central sandstone stove body and placed his hands on the masonry. The stone wasn't scorching hot. It was emitting a deep, soft, radiant warmth, releasing the thermal energy it had absorbed during the short morning burn. Finally, Ephraim knelt down and touched the river granite floor pavers. The stone beneath his hands was warm, having absorbed radiant heat from the room all day long. Step 3. The moisture and air quality check. Ephraim, who had spent weeks fighting frozen condensation blankets and choking wood smoke in his own log cabin, walked the entire perimeter of the dugout, searching every corner for signs of dampness, mold, or frost. He found none. The walls were dry as bone. The single south-facing glass window was completely clear of ice, allowing bright winter sunlight to stream across the room. He looked up at the high-ceiling flue, made from the hollowed cedar log, and felt a subtle, continuous upward draft. The passive stack ventilation system was working perfectly, pulling fresh air in near the floor, circulating it across the warm room, and exhausting moisture and carbon dioxide out the roof without creating a single cold draft. Relative humidity in the room measured a comfortable 40%. Step 4. The fuel inventory. Finally, Gideon walked over to Elias's interior wood nook to inspect his fuel supply. He expected to find a massive pile of logs tucked away in the corner. Instead, he found a neat stack of just 12 small split pine logs, which Elias explained was his entire wood supply for the next 3 days. Elias then led the two men to the door and showed them his outdoor wood stack on the terrace. Over the course of 24 days of sub-zero cold, Elias had consumed less than half a cord of wood. Gideon and Ephraim stood in the center of the warm room, looking at Elias's daughters playing barefoot on the granite floor, and then down at the spirit thermometer in Ephraim's hand, which still read 64 degrees. All of their experience, all of their conventional assumptions about frontier construction, had been thoroughly dismantled by the undeniable physical reality standing right in front of them. Ephraim Holt pulled a small, leather-bound ledger and a stub of pencil from his coat pocket. Sitting down at Elias's table in the 64-degree room, the veteran homesteader began doing the hard, undeniable math right there on paper, creating a direct side-by-side comparison between the conventional homes in the valley and Elias's earth-sheltered dugout. He wrote down the figures for Gideon Thorne's grand house. 4 full cords of wood burned in 24 days, indoor temperature hovering at 36 degrees, 2 family members suffering from severe frostbite, 4 rooms abandoned, fences and furniture chopped up for kindling. He wrote down the figures for his own log cabin. 3.5 cords of wood burned, indoor temperature at 32 degrees, cabin walls warped and chinking, destroyed by frost heave, family choking on wood smoke 16 hours a day. Then he wrote down the figures for Elias Vance's dugout. 1/3 of a cord of wood burned over 24 days, indoor temperature holding at a steady 64 degrees, fuel savings exceeding 87%. 0 frostbite, 0 illness, 0 structural damage, and a family living in complete shirt-sleeve comfort. Ephraim set the pencil down on the table, looked at the ledger pages, and then looked up at Gideon Thorne. The numbers were so stark, so overwhelming, that no argument or excuse could possibly stand against them. Gideon Thorne stood silently for a long moment, staring at the numbers on the paper. The broad, arrogant timber merchant who had mocked Elias in front of the entire community at the trading post 4 months ago seemed to shrink. He looked at Elias Vance, who was standing quietly by the door, making no effort to brag, gloat, or say "I told you so." Gideon walked across the room. He reached out his large, calloused hand, took Elias's hand, and shook it firmly. Then, with a voice thick with emotion and eyes shining with unshed tears, Gideon bowed his head and spoke words that were heard by everyone in the room. He told Elias that he was deeply sorry for the things he had said at the trading post. He admitted that he had acted like an arrogant fool, blinded by his own pride and the belief that newer and more expensive was always better. He acknowledged that while he and the other builders in the valley had been trying to fight nature with brute force and burning fortunes in wood, Elias had possessed the true wisdom to understand nature, work alongside it, and build a sanctuary that saved his family's lives. Ephraim Holt stood up, placed his heavy hand on Elias's shoulder, and added his own confession. He told Elias that 20 years on the frontier had made him think he knew everything about survival, but Elias had taught him more about real building science in 10 minutes than 2 decades of hard labor ever had. He asked Elias if, when the weather finally cleared, he would be willing to come to his homestead and teach him how to dig a thermal shelter into the ridge behind his cabin. Elias smiled warmly, shook both men's hands, and told them that there was no need for apologies. He explained that he hadn't built the dugout to prove anyone wrong or win an argument. He had built it simply because he loved his wife and daughters, and he couldn't bear to watch them shiver through another winter. He promised them that as soon as the ground thawed in the spring, he would help every family in the Blackfoot Valley design and build their own earth-sheltered sanctuaries. When the great polar freeze of 1887 finally broke in late December and the spring thaw swept across the Montana Territory in 1888, the story of Elias Vance's dugout spread like wildfire across the West. It was no longer referred to as a badger burrow or a dirt hole. It was spoken of with deep respect as the Vance Thermal Shelter. The Blackfoot Valley underwent an architectural transformation. Homesteaders didn't all abandon their timber cabins, but they rapidly adapted Elias's core physical principles. A popular hybrid design emerged: known locally as the Brenner-Vance hybrid. Ranchers began excavating deep earth berms against the north and west walls of their existing log homes, stacking heavy sod against the timber to eliminate convective wind cooling. Others built earth-sheltered additions directly into adjacent hillsides, connected to their main houses by short, enclosed corridors, using the underground rooms as primary winter sleeping quarters and storm sanctuaries. Gideon Thorne, showing the true mark of a reformed man, publicly acknowledged Elias's genius at the next Cattlemen's Association meeting. He hired Elias as a master design consultant for his lumber yard, and together they developed pre-cut timber framing kits specifically engineered to support heavy sod roofs and earth-sheltered back walls. The social friction and isolation that Clara and the girls had faced vanished completely, replaced by deep community gratitude and respect. Elias became one of the most sought-after builders in the territory. What Elias Vance accomplished on that Montana ridge in 1887 was an early, intuitive execution of principles that modern building science now celebrates as the pinnacle of sustainable architecture. Today, advanced structural engineers, passive house designers, and earthship builders use the exact same thermodynamic laws that Elias discovered with his pickaxe and mercury thermometer. Modern earth-sheltered homes utilize the ground's stable geothermal temperature baseline to reduce heating and cooling loads by up to 90%. High-efficiency masonry heaters, modeled after the serpentine flue design Elias built in his sandstone stove, are recognized today as the cleanest, most efficient wood-burning systems in existence, capturing combustion heat in heavy stone mass, rather than losing it up the chimney. Contemporary solar design relies heavily on Elias's principle of south-facing glass placement, combined with high-density interior thermal mass, like the river granite floor pavers and solid rock bench, to store daytime solar radiation and radiate it back through the night. Elias didn't have computer simulations, R-value charts, or modern engineering degrees. He had something far more powerful: the humility to observe how the physical world actually works, the patience to test his ideas against reality, and the courage to follow physical truth even when an entire community laughed at him. At its core, this story is not about dirt, stone, or thermodynamic equations. It is a story about the boundless depth of human devotion. Elias Vance did not spend months breaking his back against the rocky clay of that ridge to achieve fame, win an argument, or prove his intelligence to the men at the trading post. He dug into the earth out of pure, unyielding love for his family. He had stood in a freezing, drafty log cabin during the winter of 1885 and watched his 8-year-old daughter gasp for air through a severe lung infection. In that dark moment, he made a silent vow that he would do whatever it took, even if it meant digging into the side of a mountain with his bare hands and enduring the laughter of his neighbors, to ensure his wife and children would never suffer from the killing cold again. When the ultimate test came in the winter of 1887, and the worst Arctic freeze in recorded history swept across the plains, his devotion bore fruit. While the rest of the valley lived in fear, shivering around dying fires and watching their woodpiles vanish, Elias Vance's family rested in complete safety. His daughters played barefoot on warm river stones, breathing clean, dry air, protected by 14 feet of earth, and the quiet genius of a father who refused to let them freeze. The earth-sheltered dugout on the Blackfoot Ridge stood for nearly half a century, long outlasting the grand timber homes that had once mocked its existence. Decades later, when historians and architects surveyed the valley, they found that while conventional cabins had rotted, warped, or burned away, Elias Vance's stone and sod sanctuary remained structurally sound, its granite hearth still resting quietly against the thermal embrace of the Montana hillside. Elias never patented his design, nor did he ever seek fame or compensation from the dozens of families who copied his methods. For him, the ultimate reward was never the praise of master builders or the defeat of his doubters. It was the quiet memory of watching his daughters sleep soundly through the darkest freeze of 1887, warm, safe, and breathing clean air, while the storm raged harmlessly overhead. His legacy remains a timeless reminder for every generation that real innovation rarely comes from expensive complexity or flashy trends. It belongs to those who have the humility to observe natural physical laws, the courage to stand firm against public ridicule, and the willingness to dig deep to protect the people they love.